In a secluded villa in Herrlingen, a peaceful German village nestled above Ulm, August 1944 found a man with a bandaged head seated at a writing desk. His left eye remained swollen, a persistent reminder, and turning his head fully to the right was still impossible. Doctors had assured him that lesser men would not have survived the incident near St. Foy de Montgomery the previous month, where two enemy fighters had emerged from the afternoon sun, riddling his open staff car with cannon fire from treetop height. His driver had died from the wounds, and he himself had been thrown from the vehicle, sustaining 3 skull fractures and a shattered cheekbone. Medical professionals had expected his death in a French field hospital, yet he had endured. Now, in these slow, careful afternoons, the man, Field Marshal Rommel, the soldier once known as the Desert Fox, the Wehrmacht's most celebrated figure, committed his thoughts to paper. He filled pages with notes, dictated reflections to his aide, and penned private observations for his son. He meticulously consumed every situation report arriving from the Western Front, tracing the lines on maps by hand. What those maps revealed to him in mid-August 1944 was a reality he could not dislodge from his mind. Somewhere in the open country south of Avranches, Normandy, an entirely new American army had been unleashed. Its commander, whose name Rommel had already seen in the newspapers, led a force that hadn't even existed a month prior. In under 3 weeks, it had ripped a chasm through the German Western Front so vast that the Field Marshal, pen in hand in his quiet room, struggled to accept the stark implications unfolding on the paper before him. He wrote a sentence that would, 9 years later, appear in a book compiled from his private documents. In Tunisia, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but brought rich dividends. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, although we had to wait until the Patton army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. The most astonishing. This pronouncement came from the very man who had literally authored the book on mobile warfare, whose panzers had bisected France in a mere 6 weeks in 1940, who had driven the British to the sea at Dunkirk, and who had relentlessly pursued the Eighth Army across 1,000 miles of North African desert. He was not a man given to casual praise, nor to offering false compliments to his adversaries. When he inscribed that sentence, he intended its meaning in the most literal sense possible. He was observing something entirely novel, an unprecedented display of his own principles of movement, his profound belief in speed, his philosophy of the bold, decisive stroke, executed at a scale and tempo that his own Wehrmacht could no longer hope to match. The question then becomes, how could the Desert Fox, the recognized master of mechanized warfare, find himself convalescing in 1944 and acknowledge that an American general he had never personally encountered had surpassed him in the very art they both claimed to command? To comprehend this transformation of tactical doctrine into overwhelming reality, we must look further back, not to the beaches of Normandy, nor even to the campaigns in North Africa, but to a quiet classroom of the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1909. There, a 23-year-old cadet immersed himself in obsessive study, devouring accounts of every mounted charge, every flanking maneuver, every cavalry breakthrough from Alexander the Great onward. This is the narrative of how a man, born into an era defined by horses and sabers, ultimately pioneered a form of warfare that the Germans themselves would find impossible to halt. It's also the story of how the field marshal, watching from his sickbed, grasped the significance of what he saw before most Allied newspapers even articulated it. Our story must begin with an individual who, on paper, hardly appeared to be a revolutionary. He was George Smith Patton, Jr., born in November 1885 in San Gabriel, California, into a family with a distinguished Virginia military heritage. His grandfather had served the Confederacy, dying from his wounds at Winchester in 1864, and his father was a lawyer of considerable means. Young George spent his formative years reading Homer and Xenophon aloud, riding horses daily, and by the age of 9, had resolved that he would be nothing other than a soldier. He attended the Virginia Military Institute for a year before entering West Point. His path through the academy was not straightforward. He required 5 years to graduate, having been set back after failing mathematics in his first year. This trajectory hardly suggests a prodigy. Instead, it reveals the biography of a tenacious boy, unwavering in his chosen course. The crucial element for our understanding lies in how he occupied his free hours. He delved into history, not with the dry detachment of one collecting facts, but with the fervent intensity of a man seeking the very essence of war. He studied Frederick the Great. He analyzed Napoleon's maxims. He absorbed the strategies of the Mongol horse armies. He read Caesar in the original Latin, believing that a translation could not adequately convey the ancient mind. Above all, he immersed himself in the study of cavalry, fixated on the meaning of speed, the implications of a single, decisive thrust capable of fracturing a battle line before the enemy could react. Before the First World War, he honed his fencing skills at the cavalry school in Saumur, France, and represented the United States in the modern pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics in 1912. By the time American forces deployed to France in 1917, he stood as one of the few officers who had dedicated years to contemplating the dynamics of mounted combat and predicting the consequences of replacing horses with machines. He soon received his answer. In 1917, at Langres, he was assigned to help establish the first American tank corps. He subsequently commanded the inaugural American tank attack in history at Saint-Mihiel in September 1918. Later that same month, near the Meuse-Argonne, he suffered a severe wound, shot through the thigh while leading his men forward on foot. The remainder of the war he spent in a hospital bed, a period he later described as planning the war he would fight next. When the armistice arrived, most of the American army returned home and relegated tanks to memory for the next 15 years. Yet, he did not forget. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, as the interwar United States Army faced drastic budget cuts, shrinking to a force smaller than Portugal's, he continued to write, publish, and advocate in service journals that the tank was not a fleeting curiosity, but the undisputed future of land warfare. In the 1930s, he was one among a small, dispersed cadre of officers across several nations who believed the next global conflict would be waged and won by armored forces moving with unprecedented velocity. A German officer named Heinz Guderian articulated similar ideas in his writings. Charles de Gaulle, then a young French colonel, published the same argument in Paris. These three men operated independently. Their specific emphases varied, but their overarching vision converged. Armor meant speed, speed ensured victory, and hesitation was fatal. The Germans, under Guderian's profound influence, were the first to implement these theories in practice. In May 1940, they deployed panzer columns precisely as these forward-thinking officers had described, and in 6 weeks, they dismantled the French army. Erwin Rommel, then a divisional commander, spearheaded the 7th Panzer Division through Belgium and northern France with a velocity that stunned the world. He often found himself 50 miles ahead of his own headquarters, seizing bridges through sheer bluff and bypassing strong points, leaving the infantry to consolidate behind him. By the conclusion of the French campaign, German newspapers had dubbed him the Ghost Division Commander, a testament to his elusive speed that often left even his own staff uncertain of his precise location. American observers meticulously noted these developments, studying the reports. In theory, they grasped the revolutionary implications, but most then reverted to drilling conscripts in conventional infantry formations. The United States possessed no substantial armored force in 1940, nor any immediate, aggressive plan to rapidly construct one. The man who would ultimately build it was Patton, then 54 years old, appointed a major general and given command of the fledgling 2nd Armored Division at Fort Benning, Georgia. He trained his men with the intensity he had been anticipating for 2 decades, instilling in them the critical importance of speed, the shock of the assault, and what he termed the holy instinct of relentlessly driving the enemy backward. "A pint of sweat," he often remarked, "will save a gallon of blood." This was not a mere slogan. It embodied his entire philosophy for waging mechanized war. By early 1943, Patton found himself in Tunisia, commanding the Second Corps following the American debacle at Kasserine Pass. He inherited a profoundly shaken force and, within weeks, forged it into a cohesive fighting unit. Rommel had already departed North Africa by then, flown back to Europe, sick and exhausted, but he carefully reviewed the reports detailing the fate of his Africa Corps after his departure. He drew his own conclusions regarding the Americans' emerging capabilities. The pivotal sentence he would later write in Herrlingen about American experience had its genesis in Tunisia. In Tunisia, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but the Germans were winning. That crucial context cannot be overlooked. In the summer of 1940, while Patton was still drafting staff papers at Fort Myer, the Wehrmacht had crushed the French army in 6 weeks, driven the British Expeditionary Force into the English Channel, and fundamentally redefined modern warfare. By 1941, they had penetrated 3,000 miles into the Soviet Union, reaching the outskirts of Moscow before the brutal winter and determined Russian resistance forced them back. In 1942, Rommel's Africa Corps had advanced to within 60 miles of Alexandria, in Egypt. The Germans, with ample reason, believed they possessed an understanding of mobile warfare unmatched by any other nation. They even had their own term for it, Befehlgegenkrieg, the War of Movement. Their soldiers, however, simply called it Blitzkrieg or Lightning War. The American landings in North Africa in November 1942 represented their initial significant confrontation with the Wehrmacht in the West. This trial proved difficult. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, an untested American force suffered a severe defeat at the hands of Rommel's seasoned veterans. The United States lost over 6,000 men and more than 200 tanks in a single week. German officers, analyzing the after-action reports, concluded that the Americans were incapable of standing against experienced troops. They referred to the United States Army with a subtly disdainful moniker, the Dollar Army, implying that while Americans possessed wealth, they lacked true soldiers. This perception of American fighting capabilities was what Rommel carried with him when he was transferred back to Europe in March 1943. His new assignment involved inspecting the coastal defenses of France. For the next 15 months, as commander of Army Group B, he meticulously fortified what the Germans termed the Atlantic Wall, preparing for an invasion he knew was inevitable. He worked with obsessive intensity, personally traversing miles of beach, ordering the deployment of millions of mines, thousands of obstacles, and tens of thousands of concrete bunkers. He harbored no doubt that the Americans would arrive. His skepticism concerned how effectively they would fight once they did, the Kasserine report still resonating in his mind. When the invasion finally commenced on June 6, 1944, Rommel was absent. He had driven home to Herrlingen to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday, an innocent lapse in timing for which he would pay dearly every day thereafter. He rushed back to Normandy, and for the subsequent 6 weeks, he found himself engaged in the very type of defensive struggle he had always dreaded. One fought without air superiority against an adversary whose production capacity far outstripped his own. On July 17th, as recounted, his staff car was caught exposed by Allied fighters near Saint-Foy-de-Montgomery. He was transported unconscious to a French field hospital. By the time his full consciousness returned, a new American army was poised for activation in Normandy, and the final act of Erwin Rommel's long professional life was about to unfold, not on the front lines, but in a room, seated at a desk with a pencil and a stack of maps. What he subsequently observed between August and October of 1944 demands our immediate attention. August 1st, 1944, at Avranches, situated at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. The United States Third Army formally came into being at noon. Its commander, Lieutenant General George Patton, had endured nearly a year of enforced idleness in England, barred from leading troops in combat due to an incident in Sicily the previous year, where he had struck 2 shell-shocked soldiers in a field hospital. That single outburst had almost terminated his career. Instead of dismissing him outright, Eisenhower had held him in reserve, utilizing him as a crucial decoy in the deception plans for the Normandy landings. Finally, he was unleashed once Operation Cobra had successfully ruptured the German line near St. Lo. The army Patton now commanded was far from a refined instrument. It was a hastily assembled force comprising 4 corps, 13 divisions, and a modest tactical air command, the 19th, under Brigadier General Otto Wayland. Most of its soldiers had never fought together, and many had experienced combat for only a few weeks. The terrain stretching before them, the open country east of Avranches, was unfamiliar, and the logistical strategy for supplying fuel and ammunition to a rapidly advancing army was largely improvised. What Patton achieved with these disparate elements over the next 26 days became the very subject of Rommel's study in his Herrlingen garden. The 4th Armored Division, led by Major General John Wood, a tall, outspoken artilleryman who had instilled in his tankers precisely the aggressive spirit Patton desired, had already burst through Avranches on July 30th. The following day, it poured south across the Pont-Taubalt Bridge, even before the Third Army officially became operational. During the first week of August, Wood propelled his columns south and east at a tempo that nothing in the German line could match. They bypassed the city of Rennes, which the 8th Infantry Division liberated on August 4th, and then swung deep into Brittany. On August 7th, Hitler ordered a counterattack at Mortain intended to sever Patton's supply lines. The counterattack failed decisively. The 30th Infantry Division, under Major General Leland Hobbs, held its ground at Mortain, refusing to yield, and Allied air power decimated the German armor in the open fields as soon as the morning fog dissipated. While that battle still raged, Patton redirected the rest of his army eastward, almost directly east, a maneuver at a speed no army had ever attempted. By August 8th, the 15th Corps had taken Le Mans. On the 12th, it reached Argenton, forming the southern jaw of what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. Within this pocket, 2 German armies, the 7th and the 5th Panzer, were being gradually encircled by Canadian forces pushing south and American forces driving north. Patton desired to seal the gap by pushing his 15th Corps directly through Argenton into Falaise. However, the American Army Group commander, Omar Bradley, held him back, concerned about the potential for friendly fire between the 2 Allied forces in the dense fog. Approximately 100,000 Germans managed to escape through the narrow opening that remained, but another 50,000 were killed or captured, with 10,000 perishing within the pocket itself. The 7th Army, the force that had opposed the Normandy landings, was effectively annihilated. By August 15th, Patton's 20th Corps had crossed the Sarthe River. By the 19th, the leading elements of the 3rd Army were on the Seine, 200 miles east of Avranches. The French 2nd Armored Division, commanded by Jacques Leclerc, which had fought alongside Patton's 15th Corps around Le Mans and Argenton earlier in the month, was transferred to Leonard Géraud's 5th Corps of the 1st Army on August 20th and directed east to liberate Paris. It entered the city on August 25th, and the German garrison surrendered that afternoon. Between August 1st and the end of the month, Patton's 3rd Army had advanced farther and faster than any American army had ever moved in the field. On some days, his tank columns covered 60 miles from dawn to dusk against a retreating enemy utterly incapable of reforming a line quickly enough to halt their progress. This was the Patton army Rommel was analyzing in Herrlingen. The reports reaching German headquarters were fragmented, a consequence of collapsing German communications in the West, yet they were consistently alarming. The Americans are already at Le Mans. The Americans are already at Orleans. The Americans have crossed the Seine at 5 places simultaneously. A German officer captured that month, interrogated by an Allied intelligence team, uttered a statement recorded in the transcripts that perfectly encapsulated the Wehrmacht's growing apprehension about Patton. "We know he is coming," the officer stated. "We do not know from which direction. We do not know when. We only know that our reserves will not arrive before he has already taken the next town. Consider one of the ordinary individuals who made this extraordinary speed possible. His name was Harold O. Miller, known as Hal to his squadron mates. Born in 1924 in Galt, California, a farming community. He grew up in Santa Rosa, graduating from his high school in 1942. He was 20 years old when he undertook his first combat mission on May 3, 1944, as a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt pilot in the 352nd Fighter Squadron of the 353rd Fighter Group, based at Royal Air Force Raiden near Ipswich in England. His Thunderbolt bore the nickname Sniffles. He was the youngest pilot in his squadron. On the morning of July 24, 1944, a week before the Third Army's activation, Miller flew a ground attack mission near the French town of Liverat. He spotted a large, open staff car with officers in the back, traversing a country road. He dove upon it, emptying every gun in his aircraft. His gun camera documented the attack. He never knew, nor would he be definitively informed in his lifetime, who occupied that vehicle. For months afterward, hometown newspapers in Santa Rosa proclaimed him the boy who got Rommel. Subsequent research, including work by archivist Reginald Byron at the Tangmere Military Aviation Museum, would conclude that the most probable pilots to have actually struck Rommel's car at St. Foy de Montgomery on July 17th were Charlie Fox of the Royal Canadian Air Force's No. 412 Squadron, with the second possibility being Johannes Lew of the Royal Air Force, a South African. Miller had, in fact, strafed a different staff car on a different day. Yet, the precise identity of Rommel's attacker ultimately matters less, because by mid-August 1944, hundreds of pilots like how Miller populated the skies over France. These men, barely into their 20s, having learned to fly just 2 years prior, now commanded the daylight hours over every German road between the Seine and the Saar. This aerial dominance constituted one of the fundamental reasons Patton could achieve such rapid progress. He possessed the sky. The men of the Red Ball Express provided the other crucial factor. If your father or uncle drove a truck for the Quartermaster Corps in France during the autumn of 1944, his name deserves remembrance. He was part of an undertaking the American military had never before attempted, and a feat the Germans, even at their peak, could not have replicated. It is worth pausing to acknowledge these individuals. The young men in the cabs of those Jimmies, approximately 75% of whom were African-American soldiers in a still segregated army, kept Patton's tanks moving on little more than cold coffee, cigarettes, and sheer force of will. A small moment of recognition helps prevent the memory of their immense effort from fading into silence. Now, we turn to the aspect of the campaign that Rommel, in his Herrlingen garden during September, was likely examining with the sharpest professional acuity of his life. For what he had witnessed in August was speed against a collapsing enemy. What he observed in September, however, was speed directed against his own reinforcements. On September 12, 1944, Patton's Third Army reached the Moselle River in Lorraine. 6 weeks of relentless campaigning had taken their toll. The American troops were weary, their tanks showing significant wear. While the Red Ball Express had sustained their advance, the logistical strain was becoming palpable. On August 30th, Patton's daily gasoline receipts plummeted from roughly 400,000 gallons to a mere 32,000, a decline of over 90%, because Eisenhower had diverted supply priority to the northern armies in preparation for the operation that would become Market Garden. "My men can eat their belts," Patton reportedly told Eisenhower at a meeting on September 2nd, "but my tanks have got to have gas." This was no jest. It was a factual description of the Third Army's precarious situation. Patton had outrun his own supply lines and now sat on the Moselle, facing the last major natural barrier before the German border, with a rapidly diminishing capacity for offensive movement. Observing from East Prussia, Hitler believed he perceived a critical vulnerability. He ordered the newly reconstituted 5th Panzer Army, under General Otto von Manchefeld, to launch a counterattack in Lorraine, aiming to recapture the town of Lunéville and the American bridgehead over the Moselle at de la Lourdes. The force assembled was the most potent German armored concentration in the West since D-Day. 262 tanks and assault guns, 2 fresh Panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped with brand-new Mark V Panther tanks delivered directly from the factory, elements of the veteran 11th Panzer Division, and supporting infantry and artillery. On paper, This was a force capable of crushing a single American armored division, which was precisely what it was poised to encounter in the open countryside surrounding the village of Ericourt. What transpired there between September 19th and 29th, 1944, became the largest tank battle fought by the United States Army on the Western Front up to that point. The American formation in the path of the German advance was Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Colonel Bruce Clark, a hardened engineer who had transitioned to a tank commander and one of Wood's most trusted subordinates since Normandy. Clark commanded approximately 50 M4 Sherman medium tanks, a handful of M5 light tanks, and the M18 Hellcat tank destroyers of the 704th Battalion. He was outnumbered by roughly 3-to-1 in armor, and the German Panthers mounted a 75mm gun with a significantly longer effective range than Clark's Shermans. The morning of the 19th dawned under a heavy ground fog. The Germans attacked blindly. Because the 5th Panzer Army had been rebuilt so hastily, its reconnaissance units were inadequate, and its new crews had never trained together in combined arms operations. They drove directly into Clark's positions, unaware of their precise location. The Shermans, firing from concealment, caught the Panthers in the flank at ranges of 400 yards or less. At that distance, the Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate a Panther's thinner side armor. 11 German tanks were ablaze in the initial exchange. By the end of that morning, the advance of the 113th Panzer Brigade had been halted. This was not a single engagement, but 11 days of continuous running combat. The Germans persisted in their attacks. Clark's men, reinforced by the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a stocky, gravel-voiced tanker born in Springfield, Massachusetts, and raised in the nearby Feeding Hill section of Agawam, who habitually chewed a cigar and led from his command tank, continually found innovative ways to defeat them. They exploited the fog when it appeared to close with the Panthers to ranges where the Sherman's guns were effective. They utilized the terrain, low, rolling farmland interspersed with small woods and natural folds, to conceal themselves from Panther guns until the German tanks advanced into their killing zones. When the weather cleared, they called upon the 19th Tactical Air Command, the Thunderbolts under Wayland, to hunt German columns on the roads. By September 29th, the 5th Panzer Army had lost approximately 200 of its 262 tanks and assault guns. The 4th Armored Division had lost only about 48 tanks in total. On the 30th, the German counteroffensive in Lorraine was called off. Patton remarked of Abrams, in a statement later preserved by Louis Orley in his biography Thunderbolt, words that would enter Army folklore: "I am supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He is the world champion." Abrams would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Ericourt on September 20th and would earn a second 3 months later at Assinois. He would conclude the war as a full colonel. In 1972, he would become Army Chief of Staff, and the Army's main battle tank, the M1, would be named the Abrams after him when it entered service in 1980. But in September 1944, he was a 30-year-old lieutenant colonel fighting in dense fog with worn tanks against a force designed to overwhelm him, and instead he shattered it. This level of small unit improvisation was precisely what Rommel, reading his situation reports in Herrlingen, could no longer evoke from his own army, no matter his effort. Why was this the case? The answer lies not primarily in equipment or tactical prowess, for by any reasonable standard, the Wehrmacht still possessed both in the autumn of 1944. The Panther tank was superior to the Sherman. German tank crews, man for man, were likely more experienced than their American counterparts. German junior officers continued to be trained in the doctrine of independent initiative, a principle their army had upheld since the 1860s. The issue was not the Wehrmacht as conceptualized on paper. The problem lay in what the Wehrmacht had become. By the time Patton's Third Army was sweeping across France, 3 years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front had hollowed out the core of the German officer corps. Between the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 and the late summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht had endured approximately 2.5 million dead and missing in Russia, with Operation Bag Ration alone costing several hundred thousand in the single month of August. The first to fall in any army are the junior officers and senior sergeants, those who lead from the front. The doctrine of Auftragstactik, or mission tactics, relies fundamentally on these men. It cannot function without a deep reservoir of captains and lieutenants who have been rigorously trained over years in the habit of autonomous decision-making. Germany, by 1944, no longer possessed that critical reserve. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades at Erricourt were brand-new formations. Their crews had never trained together, and their officers were drawn from depots and rear-area schools. They had the Panthers, but they lacked the cohesive, experienced soldiers necessary to exploit their full potential. The Americans, conversely, faced what initially appeared to be an opposite problem, which ultimately became a strength. The American Officer Corps in the spring of 1943 had been almost embarrassingly thin. The pre-war regular Army of the United States had numbered fewer than 200,000 men in total. Nearly every American division fighting in Europe had been created from scratch over the preceding 3 years. Its officers and sergeants had been commissioned and promoted at a pace that would have horrified a Prussian in peacetime. Yet, this very speed proved to be an unexpected advantage. The Third Army's junior officers in Lorraine were young men in their 20s and early 30s, having passed through a rapidly established training pipeline without 20 years of peacetime habits to unlearn. They executed their orders, and when those orders ceased to align with the unfolding situation, they improvised. There was also the distinctive American civilian background. Many of Patton's tankers had grown up repairing their own trucks and tractors on farms across Iowa, Texas, and Pennsylvania, devouring automobile magazines as boys and dismantling engines in their own driveways. When a Sherman threw a track in a Lorraine cornfield, the crew typically repaired it in the field without waiting for a maintenance battalion. The now famous Rhino hedgerow cutters, which Sergeant Curtis Cullen Jr. had improvised by welding on his Shermans in Normandy 6 weeks earlier, exemplified the same phenomenon. Americans improvised with metal because they had been improvising with metal since childhood. This was not a military doctrine. It was a pervasive habit, and it was a habit the Germans could not replicate by simple decree. Then there was Patton himself. He was 58 years old in the summer of 1944. He had been studying armored warfare, reading, writing, and debating it since before many of his own men were born. He possessed a clear operational philosophy that he could articulate in 2 sentences to any officer under his command: find the enemy, hit him where he is not. He ran his headquarters like a demanding school, constantly pressing his corps commanders to push their division commanders, who in turn pushed their regiments, then their battalions, and finally their companies. He believed, with an almost religious intensity, that a moving column was inherently safer than a stationary one, for the enemy could not engage what it could not locate. This was precisely Rommel's own conviction in the desert. Patton had absorbed it by observing Rommel from across the sands in 1943, and he was now applying it at a scale for which Rommel had never been granted the necessary resources. Rommel understood this profound disparity. His entire career had been spent within an army that shared Patton's fundamental beliefs. In his final weeks in Herrlingen, as the Gestapo began to close in due to his peripheral association with the July 20th plot against Hitler, he also grasped another critical truth. The Wehrmacht that had trained him to fight in this manner no longer existed. Hitler had spent 2 years micromanaging the army from the Wolf's Lair, summarily dismissing any general who dared to exercise independent judgment, demanding permission for withdrawals at the battalion level, and punishing initiative as insubordination. The doctrine itself remained enshrined in the manuals, but the men had forgotten how to implement it. Rommel had consistently opposed this corrosive tendency since 1942. He had documented his objections in reports and vocalized them directly to Hitler. These challenges had cost him his command, and by October 1944, they would cost him his life. Yet, there is one particular moment in the saga of Patton and his Third Army where the stark contrast between the two armies emerged with unparalleled clarity, and it occurred after Rommel had already passed. Rommel ingested cyanide on October 14, 1944, in the back seat of his staff car on a country lane outside Herrlingen, after two emissaries from Berlin, Generals Bergdorf and Mazel, arrived at his door bearing Hitler's ultimatum. The choice presented was suicide, which would guarantee a state funeral and spare his family, or a public trial before a people's court, inevitably leading to execution and the utter ruin of his wife and son. He was 52 years old. He would not live to witness what Patton would accomplish in the snow 2 months later. But that moment, the relief of Bastogne, stands as the ultimate validation of the argument Rommel had already committed to paper regarding the Patton army in France. On December 16, 1944, before dawn, approximately 20 German divisions, comprising about 200,000 men and supported by roughly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, launched an attack against the thinly held American line in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. Over the ensuing weeks, German troop commitment would swell to over 400,000, but the initial blow was already immense. The attack achieved almost complete surprise. By December 20th, German spearheads had encircled the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne, with a 101st Airborne Division, under its acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, held firm. They endured without adequate winter clothing, with dwindling ammunition, and for the majority of the siege, without air resupply due to persistent fog. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers approached the American perimeter under a white flag, carrying a written ultimatum demanding the honorable surrender of Bastogne within 2 hours. McAuliffe, presented with a note by a subordinate, read it, muttered, "Oh, nuts," largely to himself, and then inquired of his staff as to an appropriate reply. Someone suggested that his initial reaction had been quite sufficient. McAuliffe then wrote on a sheet of paper, "To the German commander, nuts." The American commander. The German officers who received the response did not comprehend the word and required a translation. That particular exchange has since entered American folklore, and rightly so, but the events transpiring behind the scenes of the Bastogne relief are what truly belong in Rommel's observation about the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. Patton had been informed of the German breakthrough on December 17th. At that precise moment, his Third Army was positioned in the Saar region of western Germany, pushing eastward toward the Rhine. On December 18th, he received orders from Bradley to transfer the 10th Armored Division to the 1st Army and to prepare to pivot a portion of his own army 90 degrees, from east-facing to north-facing, to strike the southern flank of the German salient. On December 19th, at a meeting in Verdun chaired by Eisenhower himself, Patton declared to the assembled senior Allied commanders that he could launch an attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Bradley informed him it was impossible. Patton insisted it was not. What the generals in the room did not know was that Patton had already provided his staff with 3 contingency plans for a northward pivot, keyed to prearranged code phrases, before he had even departed his own headquarters. When confirmation arrived that Eisenhower had approved the maneuver, Patton made a single telephone call that set the entire intricate machinery into motion. Over the next 6 days, the Third Army executed what military staff colleges still teach as one of the great logistical achievements in the history of mechanized warfare. 3 divisions, approximately 100,000 men, and over 130,000 vehicles, disengaged from a major offensive operation, turned 90 degrees, and attacked in a new direction over congested, icy roads in harsh winter conditions, all within the time frame Patton had pledged. The spearhead of this movement was the 4th Armored Division, the very unit that had broken out at Avranches in August and shattered the Panzer Brigades at Ericourt in September. Its leading battalion was Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, the same unit that had fought at Ericourt. On the afternoon of December 26th, at approximately 4:50 p.m., a single Sherman tank named Cobra King, under the command of 1st Lieutenant Charles Boggess of Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, broke through the German encirclement near the village of Assenois and made contact with engineers of the 101st Airborne on the southern edge of Bastogne. The siege was broken. Abrams followed shortly behind in his own command tank, Thunderbolt the 6th, linking up with Brigadier General McAuliffe a few minutes past 5 p.m. In the course of that single week, he had led his battalion on a 150-mile march north in freezing weather, fought through the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, destroyed concealed German anti-tank guns in close-quarters combat, and delivered an American armored division to a surrounded American airborne division amidst a raging blizzard. Rommel had been dead for 2 months when Abrams reached Bastogne. He never saw the Ardennes. Yet, the relief of Bastogne stands as the clearest possible demonstration of what he had written about in August when he used the word astonishing. The Third Army had accomplished in 6 days, in the snow, something no army in Europe had ever done before. It had pivoted a major formation 90 degrees on almost no notice, in the depths of winter, and completed the maneuver within the time frame its commander had promised. The men who achieved this were the same men who had spearheaded the breakout at Avranches and halted the Panthers at Ericourt. By December 1944, they had evolved, in the strictest military sense, into a fully mature instrument of the kind of warfare Rommel and Patton had both studied for 30 years. One more piece of evidence merits consideration, though it originates from a source Rommel never accessed, but which historians have since meticulously examined. Throughout the war, British military intelligence secretly recorded the private conversations of captured senior German officers held at a country estate north of London, known as Trent Park. The generals residing there believed they were merely conversing amongst themselves, amidst chess games and strolls in the garden. They were mistaken. Every room was wired, and transcribers, many of them German Jewish refugees who had fled the Reich years earlier, listened in shifts, recording every spoken word. The resulting files, published in edited form by historian Sonk Neitzel under the title Tapping Hitler's Generals, span many tens of thousands of pages. What consistently emerges from the Trent Park transcripts of late 1944 and early 1945 is the frequency with which captured German officers, speaking freely to one another, returned to the subject of the American army in France with something akin to professional bewilderment. They remembered from their own reports that the Americans at Kasserine had been easy prey. They could not reconcile that memory with the formidable force they had encountered in Normandy and Lorraine. One general, captured in Italy and later transferred to Trent Park, confided to a fellow prisoner that the American tempo in Lorraine had been faster than anything German reconnaissance could track in real time. Another, discussing the Ardennes, informed a companion that the German counteroffensive had essentially failed by the 4th day because the weather had cleared and American tactical air power had returned to the skies. A third, reflecting on the entire Western campaign, essentially reiterated what Alfred Jodl would later state at Nuremberg under interrogation, that the war in the West had been effectively lost at the moment of the Normandy breakout, precisely when the Third Army was activated and unleashed. Rommel did not live to read these transcripts, but his sentence in the Rommel papers perfectly encapsulates their sentiment. The Patton army in France was the most astonishing development he had witnessed in 40 years of studying warfare, and he possessed the integrity to record it in a book that would be published only after his death by an English editor he had never met. Working from papers his widow had meticulously kept locked in a drawer in Herrlingen through the final months of the war. So, what exactly did Rommel perceive? He saw an American general who had scrutinized the same campaigns he had, arriving at identical conclusions regarding mobility, deception, and the decisive thrust. Yet, this American operated within a nation possessing a logistical depth and a pool of eager, young junior officers that Rommel had never been granted. He observed the Wehrmacht's own doctrine being executed with a fluidity the Wehrmacht itself had lost, by men who had likely never consulted a German staff manual. And he watched this unfolding reality without averting his gaze, which is often the most challenging act for a professional soldier when the men he observes are the ones destined for victory. That is why the sentence he wrote in Herrlingen, in the final month of his life, resonates so deeply. It was not mere chivalry between old adversaries. It was a profound professional judgment. The most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare, penned by a man who had once been the world's most celebrated mobile commander, about an enemy he would never directly confront on the battlefield. George Patton outlived Rommel by approximately 14 months. His life ended not in battle, but in an automobile accident near Mannheim in December 1945, 7 months after the German surrender. Creighton Abrams went on to become one of the most respected officers in the post-war American Army. The men of the 4th Armored Division, who had fought at Avranches, Ericourt, and Bastogne, returned home, mostly to quiet lives. Hal Miller returned to Santa Rosa and pursued a career in business. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, predominantly black Americans serving in a segregated army that had assigned them the war's hardest and least glamorous tasks, came home to a country not yet prepared to acknowledge their vital contributions. Many of them never received that recognition in their lifetimes.